Welcome back, everybody. I want to talk with you a little bit about culture in this video. And I want to talk with you about it because culture really is like the bread and butter of any anthropology course that you'll take. But the way that an anthropologist uses the word culture might actually be a little bit different than maybe how you have used the word or you've heard others use the word in like contexts outside of anthropology. But in anthropology, we don't necessarily use the word to refer to somebody who's like cultured or being cultured, like going to museums, reading a lot of books, enjoying the opera. But instead, we use it a little bit differently. So in anthropology, when we use the word culture, we're talking about the knowledge, the beliefs, the behaviors, and the artifacts of a particular group of people. There was this 19th century English anthropologist whose name was E.B. Tylor. And I just want to mention him because one of his major contributions to the field of anthropology is actually his comment on culture. And his comment appears, you can follow up with it, on the first page of a book that he wrote, which was called Primitive Culture. And the book came out in 1871. And the definition that he penned 150 years ago actually still circulates through anthropology classrooms today. And I'll just like directly quote him here so you can get a sense of his writing. So he says, quote, culture of civilization, taken in its wide ethnographic sense, is that complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and really any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society, end quote. And, today we can even expand this a little bit more to include so many other things like ritual, clothing, very much so is cultural, dance, music, tools, cooking, cuisine, shelter, philosophy, and the list really can go on and on. But the other thing we want to say is that culture really does shape a lot. It shapes our identity, it shapes our viewpoint, it shapes how we think, it shapes what we think is normal. It also shapes what we think is abnormal. And it shapes how we view other people outside of our culture. And, I think it's easy for some of us, many of us perhaps, to fall into this trap that cultures remain the same, that they must remain the same throughout human history. For example, that indigenous people of the Amazon, Australian Aboriginals, that they've been a particular way since time immemorial, that they're static. And that actually is not the case at all. And it's not the case for our society either. And just as one example, I think about all the shifts in education that stem just from the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, anthropologists, we see culture as something that is like learned and shared. And this is a process called enculturation. So anthropologists see culture as like not something that we're born with. It's not something that we genetically inherit either, but rather culture is seen as something that we acquire, something that's acquired over the course of like a lifetime of learning. Now, cultures around the world, they have systems for passing on culture. And these can be very formal structures like the education system, religious institutions like churches, synagogues, for example. Can also be dance classes, even going to the doctor. That's how a lot of us acquire information about health in our bodies. But we can also acquire culture in ways that are a little less formal as well. Think about all the things that you've learned about just when you spend time with family or you're chilling, with your friends. Think about all the new, maybe ideas that you're exposed to as you're scrolling social media or streaming a news broadcast. All of these really are ways that either, we consciously or unconsciously learn about culture. And the individual experiences that we have and what those have really taught us, that is what shapes our unique perspective. It's what shapes our unique perspective that all of us form throughout our entire life cycle. And that's exactly what creates the lenses that we see other people, that we see the world through. Now, another interesting thing about culture that we see is that it can be contested. There can be cultural tensions, if you will. As you probably have seen, and maybe you're one of these types of people like myself, not everybody follows mainstream society. There are like smaller cultures that are nested within a dominant culture at large. And we call these smaller cultures subcultures. So subcultures, what they do is they share common beliefs that might be unique a little bit or a lot of it from mainstream society. Some examples of subcultures that come to mind, hippies, vegans, surfers, skaters, punk rockers, goths, cosplayers, football teams, branches of the military, Greek life. These are all subcultures. But what makes a subculture is that they're differentiated from the parent culture that they belong to. So they develop their own norms. They develop their own values and beliefs, their own codes, symbols, maybe even the language is a little bit different, but they might still retain aspects of the parent culture to some degree. So if you think about it, each of you are probably part of some kind of subculture. And, what we see as anthropologists is that sometimes people's membership to these subcultures really becomes a part of people's identity. It becomes so ingrained in who we are, perhaps to a more powerful degree than for some people than their membership to the dominant culture that they're nested within. And maybe we can just talk about an example. And I'll talk a little bit about one of the subcultures that, kind of has informed a lot of my own identity, especially in my more formative years. And that's the subculture of vegans. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about them, and I'm going to explain a little bit about vegans, both from the lens of an objective anthropologist, but also sort of like an insider informant as well. So we're going to be balancing both lines here. So vegans share in common core beliefs that tend to set them apart from more mainstream norms. So they reject meat and products that come from animals, like dairy, like leather. They also see suffering in the food and fashion industries, and they challenge the commercial treatment of animals in confined animal feeding operations. Really, all vegans believe in compassion and existence for all creatures. And this is an ethic that's borrowed from the Buddhist philosophy of ahimsa. Ahimsa is really about complete nonviolence in our lives. And many vegans actually might offer hospitality to like a house spider instead of smashing it. And they offer hospitality as an act of compassion. So just allowing that spider to hang out in the corner, spin their web, and do all the little things that spiders would do. So creating like a peaceful coexistence. In terms of fashion and adornment, vegans might wear clothing that's different than mainstream fashion. When I was younger, I used to wear a jacket that had all these patches on it that symbolized animal liberation. There are a lot of other vegans out there who appropriate like more permanent symbols of their identity. So they get tattoos that could be emblematic or symbolic of their commitment to this lifestyle. So in this way, it's like the core of a vegan's beliefs and their philosophies, it's like they're very different from mainstream society that they also participate in. So that was one example. When we could go on, being an anthropologist is a whole vibe too. It's a whole different subculture. The spiritual community that I belong to, that's another subculture. And I'm sure there are plenty of other subcultures that you identify with as well. A fun little exercise actually might be to list features that make your subculture that you identify with a subculture. So another word that we use a lot in anthropology, especially cultural anthropology, the word is norms. And norms are really easy Norms are rules for behavior, rules for how people should act. So basically, norms refer to what is normal in a culture. So what's normal to wear on occasions like weddings and funerals? What's normal to wear to school, to work, on a date? Norms also extend to what you can say among polite company, so people who you don't know and you have to be like really prim and proper and polite to, versus you're probably going to act a little differently around people who you're very comfortable with or have some sort of emotional intimacy with. Norms can also extend to food as well. It can extend to like who's considered an appropriate marriage partner. Etiquette is also a norm. So it would be normal to remove your hat when you sit down for dinner, just as another example. Now, anthropologists who study cultures other than their own, they actually have a way of knowing when a norm is violated. And this is really based on the reactions of other people. So we tend to get these cues when a norm is violated, like gossiping, staring, sneering, ostracizing. In some extreme cases, violence too. And this is how people and cultures regulate and police norms. Just one example, think about what happens in middle school gym class. This is a silly one. When a kid forgets to wear deodorant, it's like the whole school knows about it before the end of the day. And usually the offender picks up on the gossip, but the gossip is what becomes a mechanism to kind of control the offender, if you will. So if the student doesn't want to be the subject of gossip again, they're likely to adjust their behavior and probably will never forget deodorant again before gym class. Some other good terms to know as we kind of embark on Intro to Anthropology, two terms, ideal and real. And there's a gap between the ideal values that people profess and the real behaviors that people engage in that contradict it. So ideal refers to ideal behaviors or idealized standards for behavior. As you know, not everybody behaves ideally though. So really a lot of people actually go against ideals. So the real, what we call the real, is actually what people really do. So for example, we might be raised with the ideal that equality is really important, but really we see inequality everywhere. Another example, ideally spouses and partners treat each other sacredly and with respect, but really we hear of examples on the regular that contradict this. So people don't follow ideals all of the time. Often, people feel their own customs and their way of life are correct and best, and that people who don't share them are immoral or wrong or inferior. And this is a really important attitude that I think anthropologists have really put their finger on. And we have a term for it, and it's called ethnocentrism. A lot of examples we can go over here. So an example of ethnocentrism might be the belief that immigrants are intellectually inferior, or the belief that certain ethnic foods are dirty, or saying people are weird because they're wearing ethnic or religious dress. Even expecting others to speak your language. That also is an example of ethnocentrism. There are really extreme examples too, like racism, xenophobia. Xenophobia is a fear of outsiders. Colonial imperialism is another example of ethnocentrism. That's when one country dominates another country. Even forcing people to assimilate or to fully adopt a dominant culture. These are all examples on the more extreme end of the spectrum of ethnocentrism. But ethnocentrism can be a human tendency to some degree, but it's like anthropological thinking challenges us to unlearn this. I think oftentimes when we are about to, start a course, we think of all this learning that we're going to do. But one of the really interesting things about anthropology, and I think this is one thing that really roped me in, is all of the unlearning that you're invited to do too. So anthropology challenges us to unlearn our own ethnocentric tendencies. And, I think basically most anthropologists or all anthropologists would agree that all of us have some ethnocentric tendency to some degree or another. When we view others through an ethnocentric lens, though, what happens is that lens creates judgment. And an ethnocentric lens doesn't really allow us to see cultures objectively. So to counter ethnocentrism, the remedy, if you will, we try to adopt a perspective called cultural relativism. And again, I almost think of this as the antidote or the medicine for ethnocentrism. So what cultural relativism is that it involves suspending judgment, understanding a group's beliefs and practices within their own cultural context. And it helps us to objectively, to accurately, and also sensitively represent the diversity of human life and culture around the world. So cultural relativism is this really useful rule of thumb that helps anthropologists, reach an objective stance about cultures. But, and this is an important part that I think sometimes gets overlooked unless we start to really dig into the nuances, it does not require us to disregard violations against human rights. Actually, a lot of anthropologists, I might even say the vast majority, are actually fierce advocates for human rights. And that's actually how a lot of us find our way into anthropology. So for a lot of us, doing anthropology is more than what it seems. For a lot of us, doing anthropology becomes a lot about raising awareness of things like violence, imperialism, and importantly, bringing voices of the oppressed to a more global stage. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.